This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday, live on CGTN. The second topic of today's show is really about the trade war. The trade war between China and the U.S. is heating up, with U.S. President Donald Trump recently announcing a new round of tariffs on Chinese imports worth $200 billion. Even though it is pending, but people already fear about the results and the impact of that worldwide. China did retaliate in kind and has filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization against the U.S. tariffs. On Wednesday, Larry Kudlow of the White House Economic Council accused China of refusing to compromise over the trade war. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce lost no time in arguing against his claim, saying China couldn't accept America's unilateral trade bullying.
On May 19th, the two sides have reached a consensus, but on May 29th, the U.S. abandoned the consensus. In early June, the two sides agreed to energy and agriculture cooperation, but on June 15th, the U.S. abandoned the consensus again. On July 6th, the U.S. launched the trade war and got worse on July 11th. It's regrettable that the U.S. has failed to keep faith and closed the door to talks between the two sides.
When the two sides are both talking tough and acting tough, we have interviewed the two people in the know on the trade war between China and the United States. They are Mr. Feng Jin, the Deputy Secretary General of China Development Research Foundation, and Mr. William Zarrett, the Chairman of AmCham China. Let's listen in. Dr. Fang, Mr. Zarrett, what a pleasure to have both of you on CGTN. First of all, may I ask you about the possible impact the two of you could help us to understand about the current trade war going on between China and the United States. With the latest statistics coming from China and the U.S., we have now felt it for the very first half of this year. But the second half, some argue, Mr. Zarrett, could be much harsher, the impact of it.
Right. And our companies are saying the same thing, that this first tranche of $34 billion, it's affecting some companies to some extent, but even more than actually affecting their bottom line, it's affecting their psychology and their concern for what's coming next. But the $200 billion, if that is going to happen, I don't know that there are any companies that will not be affected.
How is it already, the 34B, the coming up 16B, feeling the psychology and their concern, as you just illustrated?
Well, companies will be looking to diversify their supply chains, number one. Companies will be looking at the possibility of perhaps moving manufacturing sites. Now, that's a longer-term, bigger project. But the companies are already considering that. And the supply chains, they've started actually diversifying in some cases.
How much cost would that be? Have they thought about the number that they have to bear in mind?
I don't have a dollar figure, but it's expensive.
What about for the Chinese side?
I believe this trade war, the so-called trade war, is totally unnecessary and unwarranted. If we have problems or we have differences, we can always work in a constructive manner to resolve the issues. Having said that, I do think 50 billion is represents a small fraction of total trade between China and U.S. Actually, according to Bloomberg, the majority of those 50 billion actually belong to the exports for multinational corporations, not really local Chinese companies. And also, I know theoretically the impact should be there and should be significant. But we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of businesses to absorb some of the cost of this increase in tariff by increasing efficiency. But if the trade war escalates, as Trump has already intended to 200 billion, then maybe more
That's
sectors.
a totally different story.
More sectors will feel the pain. But on the other hand, but you can see China has unilaterally announced further opening up of its economy. So on the one hand, we have increased tariff, but on the other hand, we also reduced tariffs on Chinese imports, which benefit Chinese consumers and also the downstream producers in China.
Talking about psychology, we got some already quite clear messages. For example, BlackRock, which is having quite a few $1 trillion in hand when it comes to investment all over the world, coming out, the CEO coming out and say, this is having a big impact on our psychology about investment elsewhere in the world. Meanwhile, the Fed chairman, Mr. Powell, during his hearing this week, he's already talking about, even though he's coming from the Republican side, also talking about that this will have an impact on the general economy in the U.S. and also for the rest of the world. So, Mr. Zaret, what is the best strategy for your members now?
Well, I think we need to step back just a little bit and understand that the reason that the U.S. administration has taken these measures, our membership does not support tariffs. However, our membership for a number of years has had to deal with an unlevel playing field and an economic relationship that really doesn't seem to have been based on fairness and reciprocal treatment. So for the time being, members in general are, okay, we will put up with this for a fairly short period. And that's where we get into the next tranche of the possible $200 billion. It's going to be more painful for them. And we'll have to see how they do with it. And in terms of lobbying the White House, are the multinationals going to be lobbying more than they have been to try to stop these tariffs and what seems to be detrimental to their companies? We'll have to see about that. Up until now, the White House has been pretty much immune from such lobbying. And so our companies are doing what they can with the supply chains, doing what they can to look for other sources of product, and making their thoughts well known to the chamber. And of course, we make our thoughts well known to the U.S. government. And that's about all we can do right now.
And also to the Chinese government. You hand over your white paper
government.
to various Chinese organizations.
Yeah, and this is a very important aspect of the work that we're doing now, is talking with our Chinese friends about this, being clear on what U.S. companies feel and listening to what the Chinese interlocutors tell us.
Dr. Fan, from the Chinese side, I guess some similar situation in a way. You don't know where things would go because the current White House is not necessarily, is using Bill's word, quite immune to information coming from outside. So here's the thing. What about the Chinese side? What is likely to be the next step forward if this war continues, if it is?
But like I said, regardless of what's happening outside of China, China should continue to pursue its reform and opening up policy agenda. You know, after the $50 billion tariff issue, Trump announced a further $200 billion worth of products subject to tariff increase. But the increase would only be 10%. So the total number is not that big. You know, it's not another 25%. I think it shows that the U.S. and Trump himself is aware of the damage a huge hike of tariff might do to the U.S. economy and to U.S. interests. And also China shows restraint, but not retaliate on $200 billion by using a one tooth for one tooth, tactic. Instead, China resorted to WTO dispute settlement mechanism. So I think both countries have shown restraint. They're trying to sort of control the situation. So although the war is unnecessary, it's difficult to end it, but we have to live with it, and we need to do our own things. Right.
Talking about doing their own things, it seems that different branches of the government inside the United States are trying to, apparently, doing their own things. For example, the Congress. There's a non-binding legislation came out just earlier talking about the White House should not have the ultimate authority when it comes to trade policy.
Well, a lot of this is symbolic,
you
know. A lot of this is symbolic. I also want to just point out here that back to the tariffs again, the issue is, and we're very sympathetic with this administration in that we had communication through a number of different dialogues for many years, and we made very little progress in terms of opening up markets. So although tariffs are not really the ideal way of dealing with the lopsided trading relationship, I think it's the way that this administration has decided, well, we've got to do something and we need to get China's attention, so let's do it. I agree that trade wars, you can't win them. Everybody loses. But I think it shows the frustration that this administration has with the unbalanced trade relationship. So what's next? I can't really speculate. It's hard to predict what's going to be coming out of the White House
next. It's a
$1 trillion
question, isn't it?
But
literally,
we do know that Bob Lighthizer, the USTR, has been in favor of tariffs during his career, and he feels that they're a good way of getting the opposite side to the negotiating table, and that Donald Trump, well before he was president, also thought that tariffs are a good way to level the playing field, or at least to get the opposition to talk. So I don't see that there's necessarily going to be a let-up in the tariffs.
One is, what's going to happen with the currencies? Secondly is, what about the investment, cross-border investment? What does it mean for the overall global investment picture?
Well, if the Chinese decide to devalue its currency, of course that will make Chinese goods less expensive and make it more difficult for U.S. companies to compete. So if the Chinese decide to do that and to control their currency, then that would put the U.S. on its back foot in terms of that. In terms of investment, even before the trade war, we've seen that Chinese investment into the U.S. has dropped dramatically in the last couple of years, but not because of trade reasons, but because of the limitation, mainly because of limitations on the Chinese side of foreign currency going into the U.S.
About currency, Dr. Fan, there's the issue. As I said earlier, it's not just about RMB and U.S. dollar. It's about many other currencies. So what would that mean for, the prospect of the economies around the world? That there's a huge proportion of developing and emerging economies as a whole. China, of course, is included in this.
Right now, the U.S. economy is red hot. Its employment rate is at historically, high levels, and the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, and so naturally, you see money flowing into the U.S. We have seen this cycle repeating itself in the past several times.
Where was that? Or when were they?
1997, Asian financial crisis. So this is actually the result of the current international monetary system rather than a deliberate currency policy by any particular country. Similarly for China, with our shrinking trade surplus and uncertainty surrounding the trade war, Chinese RMB has depreciated against US dollar in the last few months. I think it's largely a reflection of market fundamentals. You can't fight. It's a standard economic theory. You can't fight theory.
What about investment? Chinese investment going into the United States or vice versa?
Well, in general, I think because of this backlash against globalization, you can see stagnation of cross-border investment globally in the last few years. And the trade dispute between our two countries, between China, between our two countries and between U.S. And other major economies have also heightened this uncertainty around the world. So as businesses don't like uncertainties. With uncertainties, they will reduce their investment.
But now, what about multilateral involvement in this? When we are sitting here in Beijing, you already see Japan and the EU has already come up with their own free trade agreement. So when the two largest economies, by volume, is quote-unquote fighting a trade war, others are doing their job. This is a waste of time, some say, for these two economies, China's and also the United States. What are we doing here? Mrs. Zarrett.
Our members were very much in favor of the U.S. ratifying the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership.
But that's been scrapped off by the current administration, of course.
But it tells you the direction that our companies would like to go, and that is towards freer trade. Everyone benefits if it's freer and fair. And of course, this is what we're
freer and fair up to interpretation, of course.
Of course, but this administration, this U.S. administration, feels that the way to get to freer trade with China is through this tariffs, which is going to bring China to the negotiating table and open up China's markets. Like you say, while this is going on, other countries are not waiting around. The EU and Japan with their treaty.
Right.
And of course, the U.S. and China had been negotiating a bilateral investment treaty for quite a while, which many of our companies also felt was going to be perhaps the most single important thing that we could do, that the U.S. government could do. But there were impediments to that. I just have to mention, we asked our members, what do you want the U.S. government to do for you? And the top two responses...
If they can do it for you.
What do you want them to advocate?
Okay.
And that would be, one, to level the playing field with China, and number two, advocate for a relationship based on fairness and reciprocal treatment. So you see, you've got countervailing forces here. You've got the pressure from U.S. companies on our administration, would you please help us level the playing field? And of course, that's against the forces of tariffs and barriers to trade, which is not good for companies in the long run. So that's where we find ourselves right now.
A dilemma in a way.
Yes.
But what about you, Dr. Fan?
I think we should applaud...
Are we wasting our time here?
No, I think we should applaud EU and Japan for concluding this landmark. I think China should do the same to pursue a free trade agreement with major trade partners. Canada, Japan, Korea, and China is now negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with EU with, I think, a high probability of a successful conclusion. And even the U.S., I think Trump mentioned that even though it scrapped TPP, but Trump said the U.S. will pursue a trade agreement on bilateral basis in the future.
Some say China has this strategy, Dr. Fan. I want to confirm with you whether that's true or not, that on the one hand, you work with the EU and some of the other major economies for a bilateral free trade agreement or some kinds of documents like that. On the other hand, moving on from there, trying to be a more and bigger player in terms of global governance as the U.S., the current administration withdraws from its status of being a leader in the multilateral platforms. Is that what China is thinking?
I can't speak, for
the government.
For the government, but I think China should contribute more to the international governance system because China has been a major beneficiary of the current system. But we all know the current system is flawed. The West has its complaints, and emerging economies also have their complaints. We need to work with our partners for a common goal to improve the current system. So
I see.
We benefited, we certainly should contribute.